Aloha kakahiaka, everyone. Good morning.
Aloha.
Thank you for joining us this morning for the presentation of this year's Stanley Brunn Award. And Dr. Brunn is here with us in the audience today for creativity in geography to Dr. Margaret Pearce. I am delighted and honored to have the job of introducing Dr. Pearce and her interlocutor this morning, Dr. Candice Fujikane. Dr. Pearce is a cartographer and founder of Studio One. How do you say that? Studio 1:1?
121.
Oh, that's it. Sorry. This lets you know I'm not a GIS person. I never caught that. Okay. Well, apologies.
Long story behind that, but
yeah. Okay. All right.
No
I'm going to start this sentence again. Dr. Pearce is a cartographer and founder of Studio 1:1, a cartographic artistic practice. A member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, she approaches cartography as a practice for expressing and elevating Indigenous geographies. Dr. Pearce, as you can see, is joining us today via video link. So, hooray. Good to see you. Here with us in person is Dr. Candice Fujikane, an English professor at University of Hawaii, Manoa, and author of the recent book, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future. I'm just going to say, I taught this just about 2 years ago, and my students absolutely adored it. So I'm just going to recommend it as a wonderful thing to teach with. She is also working on a new project on elemental mapping, which I think is fascinating. So in our prep meeting for the session, we agreed that I would briefly introduce the two of them, and then they would say more about themselves if they wish to do so. So I will simply say here that while their work is quite different in form, it shares profound resonances in spirit. Both engage deeply with Indigenous map making. Dr. Pearce is a cartographer who thinks about maps as narratives, and Dr. Fujikane as a writer and textual analyst who thinks about narratives as maps. Their work reflects a shared commitment to cartography as relational practice, as art, and as anti-colonial intervention. After the presentation of the award, Candice and Margaret will be in conversation about Margaret's work, the resonances between their work, and any questions you've brought to this session today. So now I'm going to present the award to Margaret, and then this great conversation can begin. And Margaret, we get to avoid the rather awkward kind of passing of the certificate and handshake, but I'm assuming things will be mailed to you so that you get to have the neat certificate and such. But so here's the formal statement of the award. So on behalf of the American Association of Geographers, I present you, Margaret Pearce, with the 2024 Stanley Brunn Award for Creativity in Geography. Your inspiring work in mapping has brought Indigenous knowledge more prominently into public discussion. Working with elements of cartographic language informed by Indigenous methodologies, you have created spaces for restoring shared memory and creating change. In projects such as land grab universities, coming home to Indigenous place names in Canada, and Native truths, our voices, our stories, your maps enable us to confront and investigate the impacts of Native land loss and removal. Your current work on Inuit Nunagat, I'm going to say this wrong, my apologies, Inuit Nunagat, a map about the ways our carbon emissions interfere with Inuit self-determination and Earth's balance, and Mississippi Dialogues, a project that I know is in process, that I'm really looking forward to, which is a public art project resituating testimonies about flooding into an indigenized Mississippi River. For your visionary and creative work, we recognize that you with this award. So applause.
Thank you so much.
Yay. All right, with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Margaret and Candice. And we have multiple copies.
Aloha mai kako. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that really beautiful introduction. And I want to say that you've done a really amazing job of putting this conference together. And
thank you.
Exactly. Applause. The thing that I was so impressed by is that even from August, there were pre-conference workshops and videos available to conference participants. And the one that I love the most is the one that's the discussion of the kumulipo and the mo'oku auho, which is your genealogy. And I would really recommend, if you haven't had a chance to watch that video, it is incredibly beautiful. And it's actually featuring one of my teachers. So my teacher is Kekuhi Keali'i Kanakaole o Haililani. And she's just a really incredibly beautiful speaker. She's a kumuhula, a master hula, and a master chanter, a hula practitioner and a chanter. So anyway, I was just really happy to see that. And it's been really amazing. It's such an honor to be in a conversation with Margaret because I feel like her work is so incredibly beautiful, and it helps to open up our imaginations in new ways, in ways that really do change the world. And we had a little bit of a conversation last week, so it was really nice to get to know each other. So this is our second conversation, and Margaret is just amazing. So I don't know. I guess I can just start with my question for you, Margaret. Does that sound good?
Can we do our introductions
Yeah. Oh,
first?
yeah.
And
Okay.
I also have gratitudes for what was said too. Do you want?
I didn't prepare anything for myself, so I'd be happy to hand it over for you to talk, just to
Oh,
talk
okay.
about your work. Yeah.
Bojo Jayak, aloha. Mako and Dodum, Bodwe Wadmi and Dao, Shishibeniak and Dao, Makosukwe and Dejnikas. I'm Margaret Pearce. I'm a citizen of Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Gasko, Sago, and Dochpia, Mina, Kedawamteg, and Data. Is everything working okay?
I need to admit the people from the waiting room. I apologize for the introduction.
Oh, no worries. I'll start that part again. Gasko, Sago, and Dochpia, Mina, Kedawamteg, and Data. I grew up on Seneca territory at Gasco Sago at the waterfall, also known as Rochester, New York, and I now live at Kedawamteg on Penobscot territory, also known as Rockland, Maine, at the Great Landing Place, Kedawamteg. Bojomin aloha, Kanaka Maoli there in the room, past, present, and future. I wish I was there with you. I also want to say, Timugwech, thank you so much for nominating me for this award. It says as much to the work of my collaborators as it does to mine, so I'm honored to accept it on their behalf and on mine. And I also want to say, since I'm not there, and I might not have this opportunity again, I really want to say that I wouldn't have gotten this far if it hadn't been for so many elders who helped me in my times of need to get me where I was going. And many of those people have been geographers that you know. Lee Thompson, Myrna Breitbart, Ann Gibson, Joe Leeper, Mary Beth Cunha, Ann Knowles, Stephen Hornsby, and Johann Fedema. All of these geographers have been there at critical points for me, and I so appreciate the gift of their support. So, Iguian. And thank you also, as Candace said, thanks so much, Rebecca, and the committee for inviting us to this session and for that great introduction. And I'm so looking forward to talking with Candace and with all of you in the Q&A. Umigwech.
So oh yeah, there's more people.
Yep, I'm sorry. This
That's
is a
okay.
little impractical.
No. I should be able to do that myself. So I will try to admit as I see people entering into the room.
Good.
So as I mentioned earlier, Kikuhi is my my chant teacher, and we do a chant called Walu Kini Kini when we enter into a place to ask permission to introduce ourselves to the space. It's a beautiful chant about knowledge being like the seeds of the ohia tree. They are the lehua, and if you see the bright red, kind of looking like bottle brush flowers. And it represents sort of the spread of knowledge. The seeds blow on the wings of the wind, embed themselves in the soil, and then they take root. And then they invite the birds to come, and the birds perpetuate that knowledge by spreading the seeds even further. So I'm just going to do a little chant to welcome Margaret, and also to introduce us into this space.
Walu kini kini ka hua o hi ale hua mai o a o lono nui a ke. Hali hali ia e ka e hulu makani. I poi ia e ka poli mana o kane hoa o nua me. Ua a, ua mole, ua mohala a ela, o ka apapane, o ka mamo, o ka nuku I iri, o ka ahi me hiki lalo ai hiki luna e vai hone I hali I mo kule. Ua ike a he leo no I.
So welcome, Margaret.
Good.
So as I was saying earlier, I am just so fascinated by the maps in your book. And I learned so much about the point of view of a cartographer. I come at it from the point of view of narrative, but how do you record that narrative in a way that can, convey like a deeper meaning, not just the facts, but as you describe it, the emotional landscape of a place. And I wanted to ask you a question about, this multidimensional and multi-voiced work that you do. You incorporate narrative into your maps, especially in your earlier work, in your essay, The Last Piece Is You. And in that essay, you explain how the place names didn't quite make sense until you incorporated canoe routes and carries. And I just love that. That illustrates that maps are not about individual sites, but of entire complexes that are relational in terms of a journey or familial relationships. So your incorporation of Indigenous stories and world making into maps resonates with the ways that for Kanaka Maoli too, the naming of places is key. So Kumuhula, or hula master, Dr. Pualani Kanakaole Kanahele, who is Kekuhi's mother, describes the importance of nomenclature in describing the functions of places in Kanaka Maoli place names. So you're writing about cartography is so beautiful. And I was struck by a passage in your 2021 essay, What Shall We Map? Which I cannot wait to teach that in my graduate seminars, where you write, quote, if we begin that way by assuming cartography is a language, we can expect it to be capable of infinite creative expansion if we have the courage, craft, patience, and dedicated practice to imagine it so. That is the same expectations and discipline we already bring to words. And so when we had that conversation last week, you talked about this really interesting kind of movement in your work from talking about mapping as language to mapping as a form of writing. And I was wondering if you could talk about that shift in your work.
Sure. So maybe all the people in the room aren't cartographers. Cartography is language. It is is composed of graphic marks that function like words, and we combine those graphic marks into symbols that function like phrases, and then we arrange them on the page according to rule systems that function like grammar. And those rule systems, as we would learn them at the university level, are data classification and map projection, making categories, but they can be any kind of ontological relationships or logics that are inherent to the narrative of the map. And so I've always thought of it as language, but also personally, always thought of it as expressive language, just as, because like music has these same characteristics, dance has these same characteristics, and film. And so I've always thought of it, well, it's an expressive language and it's separate from writing, but I'm doing both. But in the years since, it's been 9 years now since I devoted myself completely to cartography and stopped being a geography professor, gradually, I've come to see it as, I've come to understand that cartography is that form of writing that I've always been looking for. And even knowing all this time that when we look at traditional Indigenous cartographies, when we look at Indigenous map history, cartography and writing are the same. They're the same. But my practice is not that, I'm not practicing traditional Potawatomi cartography. I'm doing something else. So it's taken me a long time to realize that that it's a form that is doing something that I couldn't do with linear text. Because when we switch to that two-dimensional space that is also incorporating graphic vocabulary, it allows these incredible things to happen. So for example, as Candace actually already mentioned, we can emphasize relationality and the relationships that are inherent in a particular geography. That doesn't always happen in a map. Sometimes it's very object-oriented, but the opportunity, the possibility for relationality is there. It allows us to elevate simultaneity and bring multiple time scales together in proximity, in space, which is really helpful for Indigenous geographies. It allows us to slow the reader down, so the reader's not just going through linear text like this, because it's all there present in that 2 dimensions. And so the reader might not have a path through there. There might only be partial paths through that space. So the reader slows down and also ruminates, and there's opportunity, there's space for the reader to change, which I find really powerful and really different from linear text. And then something else that, if I may proselytize for a moment and encourage others, if you're not already doing it, to think about cartography as a writing practice. It deters some things that I see as kind of like bad habits, like using a fixed symbol palette or fixed template that might come with your mapping software, or trying to cram in every last detail, or like other things that you might, or use passive voice, for example. These are, I consider them kind of like lazy habits maybe in mapping that you might not necessarily do if you were writing and trying to express something that needed to be said. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that for a moment. But I guess I do want to add one thing, which is that sometimes people think that when I say that cartography is writing, that I'm only referring to maps where there's actual story events in them. But all cartography is narrative. They're all narratives, no matter what is happening in the map, no matter how much story is present, because there is the larger story that is being told in a particular way through the graphic elements and through the place names and other combinations of graphics and letters. Yeah. And I don't know, Candace, if that resonates with you, and if because you came to mapping from the English department and from English scholarship. And yeah, I would love to hear if any of that is common to your experience, or if you came to mapping through a different route.
You're such a poetic cartographer. I think you come at these, issues, like a lot of the guidelines for mapping or cartography that you just articulated are the same for narrative. Those are the same things I would tell a budding creative writer. For myself, yeah, I do see maps as narrative, and I come at it from a cultural studies perspective in the English department. So we look at the ways that maps convey, I look at it as the ways that maps convey relations of power. And at first, there are so many books out there on maps as lies, how to lie with maps, that kind of standard text, right? And so it took me a while to figure out how Kanaka Maoli were using maps in their testimony to protect lands and waters, or to argue for political independence. And that was something that I learned through actually giving testimony at state agencies. Whenever there are water issues, I go to the state. That's my role as a settler, is to go and to testify, to take up those often very toxic spaces in state agencies, and to present maps to argue why the protection or a particular development project is problematic for the waterways in the area. So anyway, yeah, I think that concern with how maps convey relations of power is something that I see so much in your work. And, this is kind of tied to a question that I have about, since you talk about cartography with such precision as someone who is an active cartographer. And what I also really appreciate about your work is how you identify common assumptions about maps. And you address the comment, quote, you will never be able to include everything in a map. And you show how this is an assumption that the map is an inventory with, quote, its roots in the information extraction industry of colonial economies. And that really resonated for me. And as you illustrate, people assume that a printed map is less capacious than a digital map that incorporates technology like interactive features. And as you point out, not all maps are explanatory scientific documents, and that the other purpose of maps is to convey an emotional landscape. And you have this really fascinating passage where you write, quote, intimacy in one map comes from typeface and ligature, in another from a palette of emotional hues. An aerial viewing angle in one map might signify detachment, but if paired with voices, becomes intimacy or authorial empowerment. Likewise, an oblique angle can be used in one map as a sign of respect, then in another map as a sign of confusion. Motion may arise in stepped surfaces, or the fluctuations and rhythm of a ribbon-like route, or a line tapering to white to indicate something rushing through the composition. Time may manifest in the cadence of sequential comic panels, in the direction of story across the page, or in the temporal scales referenced by place names. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of the emotional landscape, and also what you talk about is the temporal scales, the mapping of time.
Sure. So, so you gave all my examples. No, I'm just trying to think of where to pick up from there. When I am mapping, I'm really thinking about reaching out to the reader. And so I've very much been influenced by reading and listening to other artists and other forums talk about how the way that they shape their work to invite the reader or the listener in, to make room for them. And that's been a theme that's really been present in my work for a long time. And I mean, listening to jazz musicians talk about their work and on about how people are invited in. And it really goes against so much conventional thinking about the map as, you know, spectacle and presentation, which can be exciting and thrilling, and maybe not as making space for the person to change, as I was saying before, or reflect on what they might be seeing that is unfamiliar or worrisome or difficult or incommensurate with their beliefs. So making room for them emotionally, I feel like, is really an important part of any design, just as you would want to be read if you were writing, and making room for your reader. I really can't think of anything to add. Maybe I'll show examples. I do have some examples to show. And then for time, people often think of maps as about space, but they're equally about time. And of course, because time and space are not separate, but also because everything is a moment that you're mapping. And so time is really central to everything that is appearing in the map. And you can really play with that in a map in a way that can be powerful. So let me think about, I'll just try to show some examples. And Candace, if I'm not getting to your question.
No, this is great. This is great.
Okay, let me try here.
For her to share.
So I did these are two maps I did for the Field Museum in collaboration with tribal historians and culture bearers at Ho-Chunk Nation and Miami Tribe. And these are two large maps. They're a little over 9 feet by 9 feet square, and they sit side by side. And they are intended to make a space for thinking about removal and learning about removal as a very long process that was very different for everybody. And so in these maps, there's none of the words in these maps are from my mouth. They're all from my collaborators' words as we had conversations about their removals and other things that they wanted to see on the map. So my role in that sense was as editor, transcriber, and then we collaboratively edited while I was putting together the maps. Mostly what I was doing was trying to translate the way that they were speaking. So I'll just show an example. Let's see. Well, I'll just use the opening since I'm in this is the Ho-Chunk removals. Here's their title. We have been here since the beginning of time. Ho-Chunks were removed 8 times over a period of 40 years. And when I started working with Bill Quackenbush, the Tippo at Ho-Chunk, he was like, nobody cares. And one of the first things he said to me is the opening lines of the map, which I really wanted to bring forward in the way that he said it. People don't take the time to learn our real story. They talk about us. They say, oh, Ho-Chunks were nomadic. They'd always go here and there. They say Ho-Chunks didn't have a real home. We were never nomadic. We've never been. We never wanted to leave. We always wanted to stay. When people didn't want to know the truth, it helped justify our forced removals. So the way that he was saying it, it's basically in a nutshell, the whole reason why their removals have happened again and again, because nobody takes the time, and instead they make up their own stories about who Ho-Chunk people are and what they're doing at any given time. And so that's the way that it goes into the map. We're going through his feelings about what it means to share these removal stories and what is at stake in the telling of these stories. And then I also try to bring out those emotions in colors. So in both maps, my symbol for settler colonialism is this jagged, if you can see I'll pick up this cursor here, this jagged red. It's a different color on each map, but it's this annoying force that keeps coming forward, like here. And I also, this is in the Mia map, and I'm also using this kind of obscure, this is actually a German typeface from German topographical maps, but I thought it was helpful for the kind of the difficulty in understanding their words and understanding the purpose. So I wanted to put them in that kind of obscure text when soldiers or government agents were speaking, whereas their words are very clear. But the Mishi Malsaki are not giving up. Every year they would come back to us and we would say, no, no, no. So those are some examples of emotion. I'll show you an example. I'll say a few things about time, staying with this map for a moment. So there's no reading order to anything here. So the reader can go, listens to their stories in whatever order is the one that is comfortable for them, that they find. Even though there are some sequences here that have dates on them, 1783, 1838. And there are routes that have direction. So sometimes time is these sequential, this is one of their removals on canal boats down the Ohio River. Elsewhere in the map, there are these other frames that are white framed. And this is the presence of their emergence stories, which is always the first starting point of any story, which they made very clear to me when they started sharing about these removals. So they said, it doesn't matter what story we're telling, we begin with our emergence stories, and we tell it the same every time, and then we begin from that point. And those stories are always, they take place in real places, and those places, those emergent stories are always present. They're never behind them. So I put them in white frames, and those sequences are there present. Then we left, and this is talking about their emergence into this area from the mouth of what's also called the St. Joseph River. And then meanwhile, right here in proximity are the action of their forced removals, the violence of their forced removals in these same places. So this is what I mean by different time scales coming into proximity. And then just to show you, I mentioned earlier that there doesn't have to be story events for there to be narrative. In coming home to Indigenous place names, there's no differentiation in terms of the time at which all of these place names, so this map generally, if you haven't, to introduce it to you, is a map of what's also known as Canada, entirely in Indigenous place names. And these came as contributions from people. I didn't do research on them. I asked people to contribute, and it was up to them. And then we made revisions together until they were satisfied with what they saw. All of these place names, of course, come from all different moments in time. Some of them are thousands of years old, and some of them are really recent. But that doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant to the way that these place names are used and protected and stewarded. So when I look at this map, I just see that all of these timescales are coming together in the same place. And you can get that feeling from when you look at the translated meanings. But it's all still a narrative, and it's all reaching across multiple timescales. I'll stop there.
That's so powerful. Yeah, it's so often, people are removed from the maps, and you've found a way to bring people back onto the maps. And I mean, I was wondering if you can go back to that map and maybe talk a little bit about what you talk about in terms of Indigenous mapping differing from, say, Western forms of mapping by mapping the relationships between humans and more than humans, between humans, mapping elements like the wind, mapping spirits. And I was wondering if you could talk about that dimension to this particular map. It's an amazing map.
In this map, sometimes people shared about the place names, and they wanted to tell me about what was happening with them or tell me a story. And mostly they didn't, because it's really none of my business. Because it's their traditions. And I'm maybe an Indigenous person, but I'm also an outsider and also across the border in that country, that annoying country to the south. So it's really none of my business. And I know that when I'm asking them to contribute place names, the place names are one of their mapping traditions. So actually, I'm representing Indigenous cartography in another cartographic form is actually what's happening. It's the same with any map of Indigenous place names, because place naming itself is a form of traditional cartography. So it's translating Indigenous cartography into this space. And these place names are living beings. They're animate. And when I was mapping them, I try to convey a feeling for that with the typefaces I chose, and by giving the place names, for example, the ligatures that you mentioned before. So here's the place where the giant knelt down after crossing from the mainland up to his waist. So I'm really just trying to show this in the most affectionate way that I can, as a way to honor what the meaning of that name might be for them. One thing I wanted to add is that word, more than human or beyond human, the fact that we have those words in the English language is so helpful, because it allows us finally, or it allows us for now, until we have something better, to convey, to speak about other living beings with equity. which gets us closer to Indigenous ways, our ways of talking about our relatives that we didn't have before. And so it means a lot to us, or to me, to be able to say more than human and beyond human. Cartography also has to change. So cartographic language needs these more than human and beyond human words, symbols and words. It can't continue as if these conversations aren't happening. It can't continue as an inert language. It has to grow and expand the same way that we are trying to expand our language in English as we talk with each other about Indigenous ontologies and Indigenous ways of living and being. I know that resonates with your work, Candace.
Yeah. So, I mean, I should clarify that I'm not native. I'm Japanese. So I'm a Japanese settler in Hawaii. So when I work with maps, I took 6 years of Hawaiian language, 6 years of Olelo Hawaii, so that I could, I found that when I was testifying in state agencies that if you don't learn Olelo Hawaii, you are trapped within the metaphors and the language of the settler state. So when I learned Olelo Hawaii, it opened up a whole new dimension to the world. And just a simple word would be like kanu. So kanu, you kanu plants, you plant, but you also kanu the bones of your ancestors. And that already opens up a whole new way of thinking about ancestral, like the iwi kupuna, the bones of the ancestors. So yes, so I totally see. My teacher tells me that if you say the names of places, they will know to come back, and they will come back in a blade of grass, or in a flower, or a native bird that returns. A place will come back if you say the name and you remember it. And I feel like that's true. And there's such an economy in your map, but it's very poetic in that it conveys a wealth of impressions and emotions and sensations. That's just kind of amazing to me. Now, you also talk about the obligations of the cartographer. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I also want to hear more about your critical cartographic practice, but I will briefly comment on this. Yeah, we cartographers have precious training, and we are obligated to use that training to speak to what we see in the notes, the people, the events, the numbers that are behind the maps that we are making in the world. I am very distraught when I see so much passive voice in cartography. If this is another reason, if we approach it like writing, that passive voice would disappear. And it doesn't mean that we're distorting what's being shown in the map in the same way that it doesn't mean we're distorting what we're writing. For some reason in cartography, there is this idea that people are encouraged towards passivity that is, I feel that cartographers really have an obligation to overcome and to stop doing. But can we for a moment get back to what you just started to talk about, because it relates to obligation and responsibility, because you were just speaking about what it meant to be a Japanese settler and self-identifying that way, while also representing and speaking about Kanaka Maoli traditions and cartographic practices.
Yeah.
So, yeah, could you talk a little bit about, expand on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah. So, in my book, I talk about what is a critical settler cartography or cartographic practice. And I talk about how part of what we can do as settlers, I see settler not just as a negative thing, but it opens up a kind of capaciousness in terms of what is our responsibility, what is our kuleana, what can we do, how can we act. And one thing that I start with is, again, thinking about testimony in state spaces. So Kanakamali should have the freedom to imagine what a land-based governance would look like. Not like the current settler state, which is a state-based governance. What would a land-based governance look like? And that takes a lot of work to try to imagine what that looks like. And yet there's, so often Kanakamali are on the front lines of protecting lands and waters, on the front lines of climate change. They organize, and if were, looking at some of the things happening in Hawaii before you came here, we're facing contaminated waters, waters that are contaminated by jet fuel at Red Hill. It's contaminated one of our major aquifers in Hawaii. And it's a huge question about the role of the military in Hawaii. And Kanakamali are on the front lines of that struggle and trying to grapple with all of that. So I try to hold space in a way, they often schedule these state meetings during the day when people are working. So when I go, I figure out, well, what is my area of expertise? My area of expertise is narrative and reading maps. And so I'll critique maps and then I'll blow up big pictures of state maps. So again, one of the first steps for a critical settler cartography is to look at state maps and to emphasize what it is that the state doesn't want you to know. So, or the developers. So like, for example, developers will present maps of land as agriculturally unfeasible, being E-quality soil, meaning the poorest quality of soil. And yet, when you go back to the maps, the soil science maps, it shows that it's an E-quality land if it's not irrigated. And once you irrigate the land, it improves to B-quality lands. So I've kind of, taken on that kind of practice of looking at the map and trying to figure out what the developer is trying to leave off of the map. And so that's one part of it. And then the second part of it is trying to look to Kanaka Maoli images and values in arguing against sort of state maps. So I was looking for a long time for a concept of, of conveying the integrity of land, that you cannot cut land up into little pieces. So what the state will do is, or the developer will do is, portion out lands until they're smaller and smaller and smaller in size until the developer can say they're no longer culturally significant. So I call that the mathematics of subdivision. But really, if we look at Kanaka Maoli Mo'olelo, the values in Mo'olelo, we see that land cannot be cut up into pieces in that way, because what happens in one place will affect all others. And that is very clear in the Mo'olelo. There's a beautiful Mo'olelo of Mo'o, reptilian water deities, walking across Oahu. So if you look at the map of Oahu and you find Wailua, they walk from Wailua all the way to Kapukaki, which is Red Hill, where the jet fuel tanks are. And it's specifically mentioned Kapukaki. And in that procession of reptilian water deities is the principle of Mo'oaina. So Mo'o means a series. It also means a lizard. So a series of land that is connected by genealogy. All of the reptilian water deities are descendants of Mo'oinanea. So it's a continuity that I kind of focus on as Mo'oaina, the integrity of land, the ways that for me, like just as a small change in climate, like an increase, 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures will bring about the melting of glaciers and the acidification of the ocean, that same restorative change has infinite restorative effects. So it's not just on the devastation of the earth, but also on the restoration. And I try to get my students to realize that if we focus on the restorative effects, it's clear that not all is lost. It's a more kind of hopeful way of looking at restorative projects on this earth and how they bring about changes in ways that we don't even imagine happening. When we plant seaweed along, at one fish pond, the spores of that seaweed will be carried on the ocean currents down the entire coastline. And when divers go out, they find seaweed in places they never saw seaweed before. And seaweed is essential, right, to our to the health of marine life and to the health of the ocean. But anyway, those are just kind of the 2 steps of a critical settler cartography, beginning by the critique of the maps of development, and then moving into what Indigenous conceptions of space and place are.
Your comments about these small increments of difference in restoration as well as in devastation, it's so relevant to cartography. It's so relevant because maps are just, all they are is just countless tiny marks with very small differences, and just making a little bit of change really changes the map. And I feel that when I'm designing, I think about that when you're saying that these small steps, that's why they're called steps, because they are small, and that's how things happen. And it's the same is true in design as it is in what we are doing in the world and the way that we're living, the way that we live our lives. It's the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Where are we?
yeah, I know. I'm trying to digest what you're saying because it is so important. And the other thing I was really struck by, in the kind of work that you do and the work that we are doing here is how you were in the beginning, like there's this the essay that you have called "The Last Piece Is You" is just incredible because you map the place names and then you map the canoe routes and the carries, and you see how the place names suddenly take on this, it's like technicolor meaning, from the black and white names of the places. When you enter into that continuity of a narrative, or like you said, like a temporal scale, the movement of a canoe, that you see how places are related to each other. And that's kind of what I was describing. It happens at Mauna Kea. So the sacred mountain here in Hawaii, they want to put the 30-meter telescope up there. And when they try to argue for it, they say, they put a map up there with like 5 spaces, and they put the telescope in the middle, 5 sacred spaces, 5 traditional, they call them traditional and historic sites. And then they put the telescope in the middle and say, see, it's not actually on any of the sacred sites. And if you back up and you look at the summit of Mauna Kea, there are 243 altars and shrines on the mountain, showing us that it is sacred. But when you telescope in and you only look at 1 or 2 sites, you can say, oh, they're just a couple of sites here. And I think that's the difference between looking at a site and a complex. And in archaeology, they call this, it's called sorry, now I'm blanking out. I probably will remember, but it's called, it's a form of archaeological investigation when you look at entire sites instead of individual individual. You look at a whole complex instead of individual sites. It's called DIS. Okay, it'll pop in my head.
I don't know what you're thinking of.
Yeah. I bet you it's in here. Sometimes it's kind of embarrassing when you have to look yourself up. It's one of those aging things. Distributional archaeology. It's called distributional archaeology. So that is the mode for, especially for indigenous peoples, an archaeology that considers sites in their entirety rather than complexes in their entirety instead of individual sites. Thank you.
Awesome. Hey, while you're waving that book around, could you speak a little bit about what you were, how your ideas about mapping changed while you were writing that book?
Yeah. So, I started with the aspiration of actually making maps, and then I realized how hard it is. So I decided, you know what? I think what I'm going to do is analyze the maps that Kanaka Maoli present in their testimony. And that became a way of foregrounding Kanaka Maoli voices in these struggles. There's a map, for example, of Mauna Kea where they map all the view planes from the summit to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, to the constellations, to sacred sites all over Hawaii. And that map is just amazing. And it comes from generations of observation by Kanaka Maoli knowledge keepers. So, I think that that's my role now but I do make maps for testimony. So I've done things where the developer saying again that area was agriculturally unfeasible in Waianae. And so I actually made a map showing what each farmer was growing, because it's actually a community of truck farms. So 2-acre lots where they grow vegetables to sell at the farmer's market. And it's an incredibly fertile area. And that's how I knew that the idea that they were equality lands is not right. They actually, the number, like you were saying, like just the smallest detail on the map, what I noticed is that even though there were like E64 lands, that the surrounding area said B62I, meaning if irrigated, the I means irrigated, then that means the land improves to B quality. So yeah, sort of like thinking about how Kanaka Maoli articulate principles of, like you call it, relationality and relationships, and in Olelo Hawaii, it's called pilina. What is the pilina between things? And it comes in part from I don't know, I think it comes from there's a pili grass that you use to make the roofing of a house or a hale, and that roofing, that the pili grass helps to keep a family together. So that's what I think about in terms of pili and relationships.
Mhm.
But yes, so when I was reading your essays, I was like, there's so much resonances between the work that you're doing and the work that we do here. And that was incredible to me.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then I have like so many questions that I wanted to ask you. Now you mentioned that it takes courage to map to do cartographic work. And can you talk about courage? I thought that was
Sure.
interesting. Yeah.
The place that I started writing about that was in that essay, What Should We Map Next? Is that what it's called? The only reason it's
Yes.
called that is because it's part of a group of essays, and the first essay is called What Did We Map? And it's kind of thinking about, it's Hugh Brody, who is a tremendous, I can't say enough good about him, but he's basically reflecting about why did we work that way?
Mhm.
And so coming through the end, what shall we map next is more like, how are we going to make this better? Like, how are we going to go forward from here? And it takes courage. And So it's the same courage for any artistic practice. It's just you and the empty page. And for cartography, I think there's a particular courage because people, society, weighs in and says, as you were saying before, you're never going to be able to map that, and which is not supportive. And we can guess why people say that about maps instead of saying they wouldn't say, you'll never be able to paint that. You'll never be able to express that musically. Instead, they might listen and say, looking forward to how you find your way through that, but not for maps. And it's just based on my experience. And I'm always surprised when people say it, and I continue to hear it. I mean, I'm hearing it now in the work that I'm doing. And so I think that it means that we need a particular courage when there's no picture on the puzzle box and we don't even know how many puzzle pieces we have. And I have no idea if I'm going to be able to find my way to make a map or not. But we still have to do it because we need to change cartographic language to better express about the land together. And we need to put land at the center where it has always been, and instead of marginalizing the land to the side, or or everything that Candace has written about in her book.
Yeah. It's ironic that sometimes map can actually exclude ground truths about the land, so that the land itself is absented from the map because all you see are lines and dots. Yeah. But a line is never just a line. It represents the dreams and the desires of the developer. That's what an auntie told me. An auntie was saying that's what happens, one of the elders in a group in Waianae who was fighting against development in their valley. Yeah. Kanaka Maoli have 400,000 akua, and the akua are identified. Dr. Kanahele defines akua as elemental forms. So 400,000 elemental forms. And what you see in Kanaka Maoli mapping is a mapping of those elements through nomenclature. For example, there's a akua named Hinalua Ikoa, which means Hina who brings forth coral from within. And that is the natural process of coral spawning. And that becomes a part of the map at, say, like a restoration project at a fish pond, that Hinalua Ikoa, the deity and the elemental process, become a part of the mapping of that place. So I love, thinking about centering mapping on lands and the elements too, and that in a relationship, and humans are also an element. And how do we map ourselves as part of that process? So again, for another example would be Laka, who is the deity of hula. She is also the natural process of evapotranspiration. And so when hula dancers are dancing, if they're in a room full of mirrors, in a studio, you will see their breath condensing on the mirrors in that place. And they are embodying the plants that they're dancing about through their performance or their enactment of that evapotranspiration. So that kind of mapping of humans as part of the landscape is also really important, not just in the ways that humans are destructive, but in the ways that humans can be actually a part of the thriving of a place. And I'm thinking about Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, where she gave us polls. She polled her students and asked them, what do they, can humans live in positive relationship with the natural world? And most of her students said no. So it had to be a learning process to teach them how, say, for example, sweetgrass thrives when it's harvested, because it actually grows back more plentiful, like basil, when it's harvested. I don't know. So I think about those things when you talk about land-based kinds of cartographies and geographies.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Does that, are you thinking then differently about maps as you go forward
Oh,
for
yeah,
elemental? Because you brought up the wind,
yeah.
thinking about the elements.
Yeah, so my new book project is called Elemental Cartographies, and it looks at a mapping of the elements in relation to the topography of land. And this is really important, like if you look at, well, Lahaina, you've heard about, the very devastating wildfires last August, and how people are trying to, how do you bring back a place devastated by fire? And I know so many people are facing this question all over the world, wildfires all over in Australia, in the Amazon and in California, all over. And for one particular place they're looking to as a model is the island of Kaho'olawe. So Kaho'olawe was bombed for 50 years by the US military as a live fire training site. So for target practice. And so what Kanaka Maoli are doing now are mapping the winds in order to replant on the island. Because there's so much unexploded ordnance on the island, you cannot dig into the soil. You have to plant only on the surface. So what they have to do is look at the wind patterns and the rain patterns, and that will determine where you plant. And so they have these amazing maps, and they're oral maps of the movement of winds and the role of Kanaka, or the people, in planning, like in the detritus that pushes up against in ravines or up against cliff faces, and that's where it's the best place to plant. You map the winds by looking at growth patterns on the ground and the cloud patterns. So it's kind of symbiotic, mapping winds, mapping rains, but the winds are very important in that case. So yeah, that's the new work. And it's like what you talk about, like, now interviews are really important in your work. And I love that you don't use use other sources first, but that you go straight to the people to ask them how they map places. Can you talk about that interview process, what it's like to go into a community and to interview them? Because I'm sure there are so many young cartographers who are trying to figure out, how does that practice work? How best to be reciprocal in your relationships when you're conducting these interviews?
Yeah, it's been different for every project. So you have to really find the process that is the best for everyone involved with your collaborators. I can say for the removals project, I knew who I would be working with, and they had volunteered to work on that project. So I wasn't looking for new people to interview. And we thought we would maybe a few hours of conversation interview, and then I'd record that and transcribe, and then start mapping it. But it turned into months of conversations, because there was so much to say and far more than could go on the maps, and figuring out what was most important to be there took time. And so it was many more conversations than than any of us thought it would be when we started out. And then practically, I was recording on a little handhold held. So this was during COVID that we started working on that project. And I would make a conference call on my phone and record on a Sony handheld recorder. And then I used Trint software to do a preliminary transcript. And then I would just work my way through the god-awful mess that Trent makes when you're talking about Indigenous places. And I mean, it was just a mess. But I think that I hope, since we paid for it, or I paid for it, that I hope that it saved us some time in the transcribing. But transcribing, as you geographers know, takes a really long time. And it's essential, and it can't be done by robots because it's in transcribing that you hear, or that won't project, that I was hearing in a way that I was not hearing during the interview.
Yeah.
It really showed me the ways that I wasn't listening well when I'm hearing myself ask them questions that they maybe had already started to answer in the transcripts. And so then I'm transcribing, and then what I would do was edit a kind of an initial narrative and send it back. So I send the transcripts back to the Tribal Historic Preservation offices for their archives. Those transcripts belong to them, they don't belong to me. And then I would edit down a kind of a preliminary, kind of a distilled version of their words, but not changing their words, just distilling. Send it back to the person and say, could you edit further? And then we would pass it back and forth. And then I would, for the major parts of their removals, I would draft some into the map. And then for the sequences, for those comics, not the haha comics, but the comic sequences, I would storyboard them with no maps associated, just storyboarded. And then we would video conference. And it was so awesome because in the past, when I've had collaborated with people, we would look at the map together or look at the work together, but it's not the same as when I look at my screen and I'm working on the map. But through video conference, they're seeing exactly what I see, which was amazing. And so we would just zoom in on parts and I would just type their words into the map. And it was so amazing. It was really great. And we really got into like a rhythm that way. That was like a new way of collaborating that was really fun, and we really enjoyed it. Not everybody liked it. Some people just hated being on video conference to begin with, and they were like, I'm not going to participate in this. But not everybody. So that's how we got to getting their words verbatim in the map, and making sure that the way that it was represented was the way that was acceptable to them. Are we out of time?
No. Well, I just have one small question. Where can we access that map?
The removal
publicly
maps. So the removal maps are permanently up in the Native North America Hall at the Field Museum in Chicago. And they have traveled. So the museum has printed them on cloth in their, those educator suitcases that they make, and then those go out to schools. They're on cloth now, so people can work with them. And the TIPOs have their own copies to also work with. And then we did the maps can visit. So they visited Tekaranto last February, and we put them up in a Trinity Square video there in Tekaranto, which was fantastic. So if anyone's interested in exhibiting them, the Field Museum is very open to that.
Fabulous. I realize that I've totally fallen down on my job as moderator because I was so involved in listening to the conversation. I forgot to leave time for questions, and we have a little bit of time for a few succinct questions, and my deep apologies for this. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Pearce? Please, would you come up to the microphone so that people on Zoom can hear you?
Music is having both simultaneous and sequential at the same time. So you've heard elements of verticality and horizontality that happen simultaneously, and kind of on top of that, sort of the special emotional impact that sound of music has. Kind of is maybe almost on potential that music has isn't really assessed very much. The question though is, do you find there's a challenge to balance the kind of what telling a story through text versus telling the story through non-textual imagery? I'm thinking in particular about the Canada map, where you were mentioning the layer time scale. That was a way to sort of graphically show those that layering through the text, but also through other means at the same time. So it really kind of jumps out at me. I'm wondering if that's a challenge, or is the point to have the text so you sort of have a longer term interaction?
I can't hear.
Oh dear.
Oh.
Oh shoot.
Oh.
So,
Can
I
you-
can't
can you-
possibly.
Could you come up to the microphone and say it in the microphone?
If you come and say it succinctly, then yes.
Yeah. Or I mean, you could take it off. Okay, no, then we can see you. She can see you.
So,
Yeah.
okay, great. Okay, so I'll try and be quick. So basically this idea of text being linear versus visual mapping being kind of being able to reflect simultaneity by having through two-dimensionality. So first, a quick comment about it. I'm an artist cartographer myself, kind of branching out into musical cartography and thinking about how music has this potential for both simultaneity and sequentiality at the same time, and sort of the emotional impact that special emotional impact that sound can have, kind of giving music, I think, special cartographic potential that isn't really talked about very much. Just kind of something that I have been thinking about. The question, though, is, do you find it a challenge to balance telling a story through text versus telling a story or emphasizing that story through non-textual imagery? For example, with the Canada map, with that layering of timescales, like trying to sort of accentuate that layering graphically in other ways without having to read the text? Or is the whole point having to read the text and really to sort of immerse yourself in the map in that way and not having it jump out at you immediately through color or through other kind of graphic symbols, I guess you might say?
Yeah, it's far easier to put it in words than through the graphics, because I come to cartography from writing. So of course it's going to be like the comfy way to go in. And I feel like I'm constantly trying to push that. And the work that I'm doing right now, I'm really trying to really move through the graphics to get to what I'm trying to say. And I feel like I did a workshop in January up at University of Maine, and we were just really focusing on the graphic marks. And I realized that if I practiced every day, like if I practiced only writing things in graphics, then I could develop, like it takes a muscle. And so I've been practicing, like I'm just trying to only make the graphic marks as a way to get used to it and stop using, not depend on text so much.
Yeah, I actually come from landscape architecture, where they always tell you the more you can say without text, the better. And of course, the text that you use is much more than labels. Like there's obviously a
Right.
richness to that but it's always kind of a challenge to say as much as you can without text. And in your case, the text tells a story that graphics could not tell on its own, but it's always
True.
kind of a matter of
But they
mixing
can
the two.
work together
Yeah.
in new ways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so I want to respect everyone's time and the fact that you may have other sessions to go to. I'm just gonna quickly, I don't know if you can see, but the certificate arrived, Margaret. And then there's
Thank you.
also a beautiful, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for your inspiring work generally and for just a beautiful session today. Thank you both, Dr. Pearce and Dr. Fujikane. This has been so wonderful.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Candace. Timagwech.